Hello. So, welcome back. This is the first video overviewing the readings that are required. I'm going to start with Module 5 since we've already done the other 4. Module 5 is focused on emotion, and I'm going to highlight all of the main ideas from all of the readings, okay? First, there are 3 components of the emotional response. There is the behavioral component, the autonomic component, and the hormonal component. The autonomic component drives behavior and hormonal reactions. And then the hormonal reactions provide a further support feedback to the autonomic reaction. So autonomic drives behavior and hormones. Hormones reinforce the autonomic response to continue fostering these emotional reactions. The central nucleus of the amygdala is responsible for the learned fear response. Not necessary for you to remember the central nucleus. Just know that the amygdala as a whole in general is responsible for learned fear responses for those of you that are interested in trauma work. When we think about trauma triggers and we think about contextual triggers and how that creates the fear reaction in the individual, like think hypervigilance, hyperarousal, it's the amygdala that's driving that. In fact, oftentimes the amygdala is thought of as the second memory center of the brain. The hippocampus stores all of the semantic information, so everything that we normally think about in terms of memory, but simultaneous to that, the amygdala is laying down emotional tracks of memory to go with those specific instances and context memories that we develop. I'm sorry, my face is itching. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is literally up front down here, suppresses the fear response as well as impulsivity and aggression. Impulsivity and aggression were talked about in one of the other readings. I'm tying them together so we can kind of make sense of them as a whole. But essentially, that guttural reaction of fear, of impulsivity, of aggression is directly inhibited by activation in the prefrontal cortex, specifically the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Is it necessary for you to remember the ventral medial? No. You can just remember that the prefrontal cortex is actively working to inhibit some of the things that are driven by the amygdala. It literally is one of the 3 main parts of the brain that inhibits the amygdala. But the amygdala is heavily involved in fear, impulsivity, and aggression because of how it affects emotions. Well, fear is an emotion, aggression is a behavior in response to an emotion, impulsivity is in response to some of the dysregulation that's caused by the amygdala. But the prefrontal cortex suppresses that. So for those of you that are interested in working with children or adolescents, the prefrontal cortex is not fully online. That's why they often have more difficult to manage experiences of fear, impulsivity, and aggression. And as we get older, we get better at being able to regulate that. However, if anybody has had a TBI that has damaged the front part of the brain, which unfortunately happens to be the most common because usually we're headed forward and it's damage from the brain. Most common is where it's bouncing off of the front of the skull. If it causes degradation of neurons in that area, it can reduce the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, which can reduce the ability to regulate fear, impulsivity, and aggression. And what's interesting about this is one of the number 1 side effects of TBI is increased emotional dysregulation and aggression, anger and aggression. And it's because this part of the brain isn't able to do what it normally does to keep the amygdala in check. Testosterone and serotonin interact in aggression. We often think that elevated levels of testosterone are what solely drive aggression, but it's really the mix between testosterone and serotonin. Men are not the only ones who have testosterone, women have it as well. And so when we see associations with testosterone and aggression, it's usually because those individuals have reduced serotonin. One of you had asked in the class if steroids reduced serotonin, and I saw in the chat where someone had said it's the anabolic steroids because I needed the name. There are links between taking those types of steroids and reducing the level of serotonin, which could explain why taking those increases aggression. Facial expressions of emotion are innate. We are born with them. And the way that we know this is we can see them in animal models that are similar to us. And two, individuals that are born completely blind, where they never get any visual feedback from other people to kind of guide how to express emotions, they still manifest the same facial expressions with the emotions that other people are. So happy looks the same in them, sad looks the same in them, anger looks the same in them. And that's interesting that we're born with it, or we're made this way. Callous unemotional traits are the most heritable aggression. So some examples of callous unemotional traits are harming animals, physically harming other people, a clear lack of not only empathy, but also remorse. So you got to kind of tie in the violence towards other living things with the lack of empathy and remorse. And that's because some individuals that have damage to the brain, or that have neuroatypical features, like, more on the severe autistic scale, they may have what looks like a lack of empathy and a lack of remorse, but they don't have the other aspect of callous unemotional traits, where they're showing violence and aggression that is calculated, manipulative against other living things, right? So it's important to distinguish between those. Callous unemotional traits are the strongest predictor of antisocial personality disorder in adulthood, as well as being diagnosed as a psychopath or a sociopath. One of the strongest genetic ties to callous unemotional traits, like the idea that it's heritable, is the MAOA gene, which regulates serotonin. And what this gene does in utero is it floods the brain with serotonin. It's just this It's this excessive amount of serotonin. The brain responds by encapsulating, downregulating receptors. So it's like too much serotonin is coming in. So, we're going to close off the doors, so to speak, to reduce the amount of serotonin that's being processed. And so essentially what happens is before the fetus is even born, they develop a desensitization to serotonin. And what's interesting about this is the MAOA gene is a sex-linked gene. So it comes on the X chromosome. This is why when we see this tie to psychopaths and serial killers being predominantly male, they're not all male. There have been, and we're going to learn about one of them, there have been females. But because it comes on the X chromosome, if males get it on the X chromosome, that's it, they've got it, okay? But because females have two X chromosomes, just getting one copy of the gene is not enough to trigger this reaction. Also, here's the kicker with that. Having the gene itself doesn't mean that you will grow up to be an antisocial person or a psychopath or a serial killer. These individuals do tend to be naturally very narcissistic, very self-serving, but they require violence in 3D, right? So not on TV, not through a video game. They have to literally in vivo, right, in real life, experience violence. And it doesn't have to be directly at them. So they could be raised in a home with domestic violence. They could be exposed to some kind of natural disaster or war. And that can then trigger this reaction between having this reduced effect of serotonin that normally suppresses aggression and fosters, happiness and kindness and a sense of calm. It can literally lead to these really harmful and frightening characteristics of individuals that make them unsafe for society, right? That's the distinction. Is it's not about are they unsafe for themselves or just difficult to be around. These are the individuals that harm other people. Let's see. Oh, and another interesting note about the MAOA gene is that the guy who did the sort of the discovery research on this, James Fallon, he's got several YouTube videos if you're interested in watching them. He has a theory that these genes can become condensed, meaning if you live in an environment that is in war for generations, that the behavior in reaction to the war can condense these genes and cause sort of a super explosion in the population. So normally we see this about 2% of the population where it gets to the psychopathic level. He argues that if you spend generations in a community of war, that this can actually lead to a much higher prevalence in the population. And he kind of talks through this example of if you are a woman and you live in a war zone, you are naturally going to be drawn to men that show more aggressive behaviors as a form of protection, and that they are likely carriers of the gene. And that if you keep doing this for generations, you get to the point where that X-linked MAOA gene is likely coming from both the father and the mother. And so you then start having where the majority of people likely are carrying this particular gene and setting them up to be predisposed for these types of behaviors. He argues that he thinks this is what's been happening in the Middle East, but he retired before then. And there's no evidence to support this at this time, but it is interesting, and the way that we understand how genes are passed down and his theory about human behavior in times of violence and significant physical threat to self, they make perfect sense and they fit with other theories of human behavior and what we've seen in science. So I'm just throwing that up there. Food for thought. Rapid assessment of emotion in others. We do this in less than 30 seconds. You can meet someone and in less than 30 seconds, you have an idea of what emotional state they're in, okay? Whether they have spoken to you or not. And this is because of our ability to interpret emotion on a person's face. And it's fostered through our mirror neuron system, which also allows us to experience empathy, right? That phenomenon of being able to look at somebody, see that they're having an emotion, and then start to feel that emotion ourselves. Ourselves. Pick the right word. And that making that determination in less than 30 seconds is just as accurate as if we had more than 300 seconds to make a determination. We're really accurate at doing that, and we do it quickly. We only get a big emotional spike through social interaction. And the example that one of the readings gave was bowling, and how individuals that get a strike when they're bowling should have like a fantastic reaction right then, and you should see the joy on their face and excitement, right? But they actually don't show the reaction until they turn around and they see the face of another person. There's something about our social connectedness and interaction with other people that creates these emotional spikes. Now, here's the important clinical consideration for this. That also is true for negative emotions. So it's true for positive emotions and it's true for negative emotions. Anecdotally, you have absolutely experienced this. Some of the most common things that I've heard from students or clients have been, I just can't stand to be around negative people that long. They bring me down. They bring me down, right? There's even a term for it. I think it was Saturday Night Live that coined the term Debbie Downer, right? Where their emotional state significantly affects the emotional state of everyone that they're around, and it just kind of brings them down. So we experience these emotional spikes when we're interacting with other people, and it is sensitive to the emotions in those other people. So for example, if you're working with a client who is, let's say, for example, really struggling with depression, and they've got one particular friend who has to ruminate with them and is always really sad and really bummed all the time. I know this sounds awful, but it might be wise to discuss limiting those interactions, raising awareness about how those interactions are affecting the mood in the person. And then the opposite of that is if they have friends that are really positive and uplifting, being intentional about spending more time with them in order to manipulate their emotional experience. I know there's a lot of talk about not telling women to smile, right? Don't stop telling people to smile, especially women. Here's the thing. If we are heavily influenced by the emotions that we experience in other people, we can also potentially manipulate those emotions by the emotions that we express. So one of the ways, for example, that I protect myself from negative emotions is I'm constantly smiling. There have been many times in our videos where when we're doing our live Zoom sessions that I'm listening to you all and I catch a glimpse of myself and I see that I'm smiling when we're talking about really difficult things or something, and I'm just smiling and nodding, and I'm thinking, oh my Lord, like, what are you doing? It takes a lot to get me to not smile and to kind of have a more somber face. I do that on purpose. I do that on purpose to uplift the mood of the people that I'm around, especially in online platforms, because even though we're interacting, there's some distance, not just physical, it's almost like a time distance in the effect that the emotions of one person can affect the emotions of another. And so it's almost like it takes a little more effort to kind of have that positive effect on others. So why would I care to do that for students? You all should be allowed to be, miserable if you're miserable. One, because negative emotions can, especially if we're angry or stressed, they can impair our ability to learn. And I don't want that for you. But two, I was a grad student for many years. I've got 2 graduate degrees. And I know exactly how stressful it is, how awful it is. I did my master's degree in 12 months. It was the fastest and most awful experience of my life. I've got a PhD. I did 2 years in a postdoc. It's a cognitive, emotional, and physical drain on every person who pursues a graduate degree. I did undergrad. College degrees are difficult. They're challenging, but it was nothing like grad school. Grad school is just a whole nother arena. And recognizing that in my students, I'm constantly not only trying to affect you, but protecting myself, because as faculty, we're faced with that stress, the fear, the anxiety all of the time. And I'm a person that's naturally very sensitive. I have really high empathy. unfortunately. And so I'm super sensitive to that. I can absolutely experience it to the nth degree. And so that's one of the things that I do, is constantly trying to positively affect the people that are around me, as well as colleagues, as well as peers out in the community, in order to keep from experiencing too much negativity, because it'll just drag me down, right? And the more people that you interact with, the more vulnerable you are to this. So why am I saying? Because you're going to be clinicians. You're going to be dealing with people who are in distress, who have lots of really difficult, challenging emotions for long periods of time, and your whole day is going to be flooded with that. Does it mean that you smile the entire time that you're with your client? No, I never did that, never. But does it mean that you make time to do it? Does it mean that you make time to sort of recoup your own psychological energy and emotional state, and potentially help your client a little bit in that manner? Yeah, it does. It seems very small. It seems insignificant, but I promise you, it has profound effects on your brain, and how that then affects your emotional experience, your then perception on the world, how you interact with other people, and then thereby how they interact with you. Okay. Let's see. Seeing fear in faces activates our amygdala immediately. Because the amygdala is an alerting system, if we see fear, the amygdala instantly thinks, remember, because this is innate, the amygdala thinks something awful is happening and we might be in danger. And so it instantly triggers an alert, right? Our perception of facial expressions is affected by their body posture. So for clinical work, this is really important. If you ever find yourself struggling to figure out how somebody feels, like you're thinking, I couldn't really tell how they were feeling, it's almost always going to be because their body language and posture is incongruent with the facial expressions that are being expressed. The way that their face is expressing the emotion. And that's clinical fuel, okay? That's important to understand. Could that be because there is some type of neurotypical activity going on? Doesn't have to be pathological, but could it be that there's some neurotypical activity going on? Could it be because someone's trying to fake prosocial behaviors, which is the most common thing in antisocial personality disorder? So that the right hemisphere of your brain plays a larger role in comprehension of emotion. And we use both visual and audio cues to comprehend the emotion that's happening. When one of those is impaired, it affects our ability to comprehend what's happening. Okay. Let's see. And then lastly, because of mirror neurons, we often imitate the emotions that we see. This is why, again, I was talking about smiling at people, and I laugh a lot. I laugh very loudly. People often laugh. I've been ridiculed for many years for it. I cackle, I wheeze, I snicker. I do all kinds of crazy things when I laugh. For years, I used to hide it, and then I just decided I'm going to fully experience this one positive emotion. And so I just own it. And I've found that it tends to be very infectious. I have IT guys who are in a different building who will actually, when they have a bad day, come and find me because they want to be around my laughter, and they talk about how it lifts up their mood. It's not because my laugh is that funny. I mean, in the beginning, it's funny. Over time, you get used to it, right? But it's because we often imitate. And so that can be used as a clinical tool. You can use it to try to influence the mood in your clients, but also be mindful when we think about transference and countertransference, how what your client is doing could be affecting you. sometimes we take that home, right? So it's something for us to understand that what if you leave work and you're in a really bad mood and you don't really understand why you're in a really bad mood? It could be because of your mirror neuron system and the types of moods that you've been working with all day long, and being intentional about how to manipulate that in yourself in order to change it. It can save relationships, I'm telling you. Our work is very challenging, and it can be a burden on our personal, intimate relationships with friends, with partners, with children. So yeah. All right, so that was it for the reading. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I will post some more videos later today for the information for the next module. Take care.